Hello, welcome to Board with Paint. Today we'll be continuing our series of painting Vast the Mysterious Manor with the skeletons. We'll be painting all 5 of the miniatures in this video. Hopefully we can achieve some economies of scale by reusing paints because they all share the same color palette. We'll be following some similar steps as in the previous episodes, starting with priming the miniature, then applying base colors, and then we'll do our basic highlights and shading, and then we'll follow up with a section devoted specifically to painting non-metallic metal. There's a large portion of metal in these miniatures, and that did take the most amount of time when I was painting these up. After that, we'll do some dark lining as we did before, and we'll also paint the eyes of the miniatures to give them sort of an unearthly glow. Finally, we'll paint the base and apply a spray-on varnish to finish the miniatures. To keep this video from going too long, I'm going to skip the priming portion. You can look at my previous videos in this series to see what I did in those cases. So we'll move right into applying the base colors. I'm going to start off here by painting around the skeletons' faces and heads with just a pure black. I'm using Decay Black from Scalecolor. I'm using this to sketch out the black in the eyes, nose, and mouth, as well as the dark areas around the skulls of Casty, Slashy, and maybe some of the others. Here I'm painting the crow black on Casty's head, as well as the feathers on the back of his neck. Now we'll go through and paint all of the skeletons' heads with Hykey Yellow. At this stage, it wasn't really important to keep the black in place, so I was a little bit sloppy with this, and we can clean it all up later. Now we'll go through each miniature and paint the green with Merm Green from Scalecolor. This is going to be the shoulder pauldrons on Screamy, some of the chest armor on Slashy, the front of Casty's tunic as you see here, as well as portions of Stabby's armor. I used the game artwork as a rough guide, but I took a few liberties with some of the colors because I felt like in the art it's a little bit ambiguous what each thing actually is. So you'll see that later when we get into the reds and browns. At this stage it really is just a paint by numbers sort of situation. We're just laying down color to get a rough idea of how these skeletons are going to look. Using one color across a whole bunch of models like this is a really good idea if you are painting in a batch. This can be really helpful if, per se, you're painting an army, if you're a Warhammer player or other wargamer, and you have a lot of the same looking model to paint. You can just pick one color and move between models doing that same color on each model before moving on to the next color. Next we're going to paint on some Skrag Brown. This is a Citadel color. I've chosen this color for a lot of the pieces that I felt like should be leather. So this is the boots on Shooty here, as you'll see. Some of the clothes on Stabby. The cape on Casty is also this color. Obviously I've sped the footage up somewhat. I don't actually paint this fast. I wish I could though. This is just to get us through the video in a reasonable time frame, otherwise we'd be here for hours and hours on end going through each and every step here. Let me know down in the comments if you prefer painting videos that have sped up footage, or if you would rather see the techniques applied in real time. I skipped ahead here a little bit. There was a piece on Stabby that I had initially painted red, but then I decided to go back and use the Skrag Brown. We're only going to use this on the upper arms of Screamy here. That's the only place we use this color. Likewise for Slashy, we're only going to use this on his hands. Casty will have the most amount of the Skrag Brown. This is going to be his entire cape with this color. Now we'll apply some gray to all the parts of steel. I just call this Lovecraft Gray because I don't know how to pronounce that word. If you think you know how, please let me know in the comments. I would love to understand how to pronounce these cosmic horror terms. So Slashy here has a whole ton of gray. Almost his entire miniature is going to be covered in the gray. I did do his shield in gray and the back, but then I decided to go back and change the color later, you'll see. Screamy only has a couple of bits that need the gray. These little circles in the front of his armor and a couple other places. I also did the trim around his banner with this, as well as the blade of the sword. Stabby's sword will also get gray, as well as the middle parts of his arms. So Shooty actually doesn't have any steel armor on the miniature, but he does have some gray fabric that is hanging down between his legs. So I used the gray for that part. Now for all the red parts of these miniatures, I'm using Hastur Purple, which to my eye looks way more red than purple. But on the bright side, this is a Lovecraftian word that we can actually pronounce. For Shooty, we'll apply this to the armor that's over the top of his legs, as well as the armor plates around his elbows and on other parts of his arms. Stabby's chest plate is entirely red, so we'll paint both the front and back with this. Screamy's chest armor is also red, and we also want to apply this to the main part of the banner, but not the outside. That part will be gray. The trim around his shoulder pauldrons are also going to be red. Now we'll bring out some English uniform, And for Screamy, we're going to apply this to the fur he has all over his back, and some is exposed in the front. So cover all that with the Vallejo model color English uniform. We'll also want to paint the hilt of his sword and the stick that his banner is attached to with this. Here I'm just painting the hilt of Stabby's sword with this. For Shooty, we'll apply this to the wooden bow and the small patch that he has in his hood. I also decided to paint his gloves this color. Still using the English uniform, we'll paint the doll in Casty's hand, as well as the central section of his tunic. Slashy's got a couple of straps that are holding his shield on his back, so we'll hit that with this color. Now we'll go back to the black and hit a few parts that we missed earlier. On Slashy, this is most of his axe, except for the axe head. We can also paint Casty's staff with this black. At the top, I just drew some rough black lines to give the impression of sort of a claw shape that's at the top, holding the gem in place. I decided to paint Shooty's arrow black, and also the arrows that are in his quiver. Going back to Hastur Purple here to hit a few things we missed on Screamy, like his boots and the trim around the pauldrons. And now we'll get around to painting the banner trim with the Lovecraftian gray. Back to English uniform, and on Shooty we're going to do the straps and the quiver. And that about wraps up the base colors. Now it's on to some highlights and shading. We'll start off by applying a dry brush using Vallejo model color buff on the furry part of Screamy. We'll do another layer of this a little lighter by adding some Hykey Yellow in with it. For more details on how dry brushing works, take a look at episode 1 where I do it on the palette. We're going to use some Undead Flesh to paint the trim around the pauldrons of Shooty. I missed this during the base coat stage, but here I'm just adding some buff to the wraps around the bow. Now we'll highlight all the green areas of fabric by mixing some Undead Flesh into the Merm Green base tone. We'll apply a few layers of this, each time adding a little bit more Undead Flesh and covering a smaller area. We'll be going for a more subtle highlight on the green fabric than we do with the metal, as you'll see later on. Now we'll use a combination of Lovecraftian Gray with Ivory to highlight the portion of Shooty's clothes that are hanging down in front of him. And again, we'll do this over the course of a few layers. After completing the gray highlights, I went around and did all of the English uniform covered parts with a layer of Agrax Earthshade. I forgot to record that portion. Since the shade darkened the brown a bit, we'll reapply the English uniform over those areas as a first level of highlight. We'll continue the highlighting by mixing some buff in with the English uniform. Again, this is going on all the brown areas like the bow and the gloves. We're going to want to pay special attention to the fingers and knuckles just to make them stand out a bit more. Here we'll want to make sure we highlight that patch on his head. For the quiver, I'm concentrating my highlights on the top, and then I go around and do an edge highlight around the outside. If you see me wipe something away with my finger, that's because I got a little bit of paint where I didn't want it. And a quick wipe of the finger can oftentimes take it off before it has a chance to dry. I'm going back to pure English uniform, watering it down a little bit so it's nice and thin, and just using that to sort of blend in the transition between the highlighted areas and the darker areas of the quiver and the straps. I'm also going over the underside of the bow just to blend those transitions in a little bit more. We use buff to highlight the straps on the bow. We'll do another layer of highlight by adding some Hykey Yellow to the buff. Now we'll mix the Skrag Brown with a little bit of flat flesh to kind of give us a desaturated brownish orange. This will be used to highlight the pants and boots for Shooty. Now we'll highlight the arrow and the arrows that are in the quiver by mixing some Ivory in with some Decay Black. I'm starting by drawing just a line with this across the top of the arrow to provide a first layer of highlight, and then I'm just highlighting the edges of the arrowhead itself to give it the impression that it's very sharp. I'm building up these highlights in several layers, adding a little bit more Ivory each time, and sort of focusing on those very edges of the arrowhead. Now we'll do some highlights on Shooty's skull by mixing some Ivory in with the Hykey Yellow. We'll highlight the skull very similar to the way that we would highlight a face, focusing on the cheekbones, above the eyes, and the bridge of the nose, even though there isn't much of a nose. Next, I decided to increase the depth of the shadows by adding some Agrax Earthshade to both the skull and the pants. This can just be applied directly out of the pot over those entire areas, letting it flow into the recesses. And then I decided to go and increase the shadows on all of the brown areas that we did with the English uniform as well. We'll also use Agrax Earthshade on the furry part of Screamy. Once dry, I reapply some of the highlights to the face with our mix of Hykey Yellow and Ivory. Moving on to Casty, we'll paint the tip of his staff with white and then go over it with some fluorescent green paint, leaving some of the white at the top. We'll return to a mix of Merm Green and Undead Flesh and highlight the tunic of Casty. After building this up with a couple of layers, we'll finish it off with pure Undead Flesh. We'll mix some buff in with the English uniform and use this to highlight the brown padded armor part of Casty's outfit. I'm highlighting each individual section with this, as well as doing an edge highlight around the outside. We'll build this up using a couple of layers, adding more buff each time. I realize I forgot to paint Casty's hands and necklace, so I'm painting them now with pure buff. We'll also use buff to paint the wrapping around the staff. Now, using a mixture of Skrag Brown and flat flesh, we'll paint the lighter brown areas of the miniatures. For Casty's cloak, we'll focus our highlights on the top of the arms and the bottom of the folds that are under the hands, as well as any of the raised folds in the cloak. For Stabby, we'll highlight his hood, his loincloth, and the lower parts of his legs. Just as before, we'll build these highlights up using a couple of layers, adding a little more flat flesh each time. While we have this mix out, we can do Slashy's hands. We'll continue repeating this, adding some more flat flesh. Now we'll move on to highlighting any of the red areas of fabric by mixing some Wild Rider red in with the Hastur Purple. There aren't too many of these, mostly just the banner on Screamy and part of the cloak on Casty. I also decided to paint the horn on Screamy this color. We'll brighten this up with more Wild Rider red and continue the process. For the banner, I'm going for less of a highlight and more of just some tonal variation. So I am concentrating the highlights near the top of the banner, even though it wouldn't necessarily be getting more light. To highlight the fur or feathers on the back of Casty, we're going to dry brush on some cold gray. Load the brush with paint and brush most of it off on a paper towel. When you apply this over a textured surface, it will only apply paint to the raised areas of texture. Continuing with Casty, we'll get out the Agrax Earthshade again and apply this over most of the areas that we already highlighted with the brown. We also put this over the medallion to bring out the texture on the chain and the areas of pure buff like the hands and the wraps on the staff. I'm also applying this to his face, making sure to get paint into the recesses like the eyes and teeth. In fact, we'll do this to all of the skeleton's faces. And I'm also increasing some of the shadows in the fur on Screamy while I have this out. On Stabby, as well as the face, we'll apply this to the orangish-brown areas. Once the wash is dry, we'll do some highlighting on the necklace of Casty by mixing some ivory in with the buff. We'll also use this to highlight the hands and the wraps around the staff. Just as with all the other highlighting we've been doing, we'll repeat this step a couple of times, each time increasing the amount of the lighter color, in this case, increasing the amount of ivory. Now we'll reapply some of the highlights to the skull by mixing ivory in with Hykey Yellow. We'll do this on all 5 miniatures. That covers most of the highlighting. Now we'll move on to painting all the metal parts. And since we're going for sort of a hand-drawn, animated look, we're going to do non-metallic metal. This is a technique that uses non-metallic paint to create the illusion of metal. This is primarily achieved through very high levels of contrast, going from a very dark color to a very light color, and simulating the reflections of light off of the metal surface. Here I'm starting with Slashy, and I've grabbed my ivory and I'm just sketching out where I want the lights to reflect. This isn't really based on anything other than me looking at the model and thinking, oh, it would look nice to put a reflection here or a reflection here. You can kind of use a guideline of what your light reflects off of the miniature, which I sort of did, but for the most part it's pretty arbitrary. It's just where I felt like putting the reflections. I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert on non-metallic metal, but I'm finding these miniatures to be a really good opportunity to practice the technique. So what I'm doing as I place these highlights down is I'm squinting at the miniature to kind of blur it a little bit and see if I get the sense that I'm looking at something made of metal. And that's how I decide if the highlights are in the right place or not. We'll start off with the green metal. What I'm doing here is taking our base color, Merm Green, and I'm creating a gradient from it to Ivory. And what I'll be doing for this process is picking colors out of the gradient and applying them, essentially easing in the transitions between the dark color and the ivory highlights that I've already placed down on the miniature. It's difficult to really explain what I'm doing step by step here. It involves looking at the miniature and deciding if your highlighted area is too dark or too bright and adjusting the color accordingly. You also want to make sure that you have a pretty smooth transition between the dark and the light and that the transition area is not too large. The smaller the highlight is, the shinier the object will be. We want to eventually get the highlighted spots up to almost pure ivory. You could go all the way up to pure ivory if you want. I think I left a little bit of green in there, but it's just a matter of how stark you want the contrast. A caveat with painting metal in this way, using non-metallic paints, is that the reflections won't always look natural from every angle of the miniature. Because if it were true metal, whenever you change the perspective of the miniature, the reflections in the places that those are reflecting and the intensity of the reflections will change. Since we don't have that, we basically have to pick out places to have reflections, and I try to make sure the miniature is interesting from every angle. Once you have your highlights the way you want them, a key thing to selling the effect is to edge highlight every piece of the metal. So this involves drawing a thin line using your brightest highlight color along all the edges of the metal. This especially looks good along the edge of the darkest parts of the metal, because that contrast really sells the effect that you're actually looking at metal. To edge highlight easily, try to use the side of the brush and drag it along any sharp edges. For these miniatures, there weren't a ton of those, so you do have to use the tip of the brush and be pretty precise with it, but where you can get away with it, it is helpful to use the side of the brush. There were plenty of cases where I made the edge highlights a little too big or I messed up a little bit. All I did is I went in with my green gradient again after the edge highlights had dried and filled in anywhere where I thought it was a mistake. Now you can see we've moved on to Shooty. He has his shorter pauldrons, which are a green metal, so we're going to continue this exact same procedure that we did on Slashy, just on the inner parts of the shorter armor. Wrapping up the green armor, I'm now going in and sketching out highlights for the red parts of the armor on Shooty. Now we'll fill in the rest of the red armor, and here I'm just making a gradient just like with the green from Hastur Purple to Ivory. I've also added some black into the dark end because I felt like it wasn't quite dark enough. So here we'll pretty much do the same thing. We'll grab our colors and try to fill it in until the highlights look about right. To make the transitions a little more smooth, you could water down your paint a little bit or turn them even into a glaze so that they're somewhat transparent and they'll blend a little better with the other colors underneath. Now we'll move on to painting all of the steel armor. For this, we're going to create a gradient from our unpronounceable gray to pure white. We'll start with Slashy, since he has the most steel armor of all 5 miniatures. This is pretty much the exact same process as with the other colors. I'm just picking colors out of the gradient and putting them in where I think they need to be darker or I think they need to be lighter, keeping in mind of where those initial highlights were that I had mapped out. As you do this, don't get discouraged if it really doesn't look like a metal. There is a period sort of in the middle when you're doing non-metallic metal where it really just looks like garbage, and it can be a little bit disheartening to look at it and wonder if it's ever going to actually look like metal. But just keep working on those highlights, and eventually it'll start to take shape. I realize this video is going to be pretty long, but I did want to show you as much of the process as I possibly could, just so you can kind of see how it goes from flat colors with the highlights building up to eventually actually looking like it could be made of metal. Let me know down in the comments if you would rather I cut out some of the more repetitive pieces and show you just sort of the before and after and maybe some of the middle, rather than sort of showing you each step in detail. As you can see, these highlights are getting pretty close to pure white, and I think this is really where the metal effect starts to kind of really sell itself. For the chainmail parts that are on his sort of forearms, I just stippled some white paint around the tops of those and down the side. Later on, when we get into our dark lining, we can bring the texture out a little more with those. I find axes particularly difficult to do in non-metallic metal because it's got sort of an odd shape and it's hard to tell where the light would reflect and where it wouldn't. If you've made it this far, I'd appreciate it if you went down and subscribed to my channel. Maybe click like on the video. These videos take a very long time to make, especially this one, combining 5 miniatures into a single video. I think I initially had over 11 hours of footage that I had to cut down into this video. And all that editing time is time I much rather would have spent painting. So your support of this channel is greatly appreciated. Now we're on to the edge highlighting. You may notice I decided to skip the shield I decided that it would make more sense if Slashy here had painted his shield, so I'm going to do a checker pattern on the back in a later step. The little studs on top of his helmet are obviously too small to create a gradient on, so I just put white dots on them. Now we'll do the steel parts of Shooty. Shooty doesn't have too much steel armor on him, just a chest plate and sort of that belt buckle. For the belt buckle, I just put a highlight in the upper right and the lower left corner, opposed each other. So you get sort of a primary and a secondary reflection there. Once your hot spots are where you want them, don't forget to go through and edge highlight everything. As I mentioned earlier, I decided to paint Slashy's shield. I didn't get all of it on camera, unfortunately, but what I did was just created 2 red panels and 2 green panels using the Hastur Purple and the Merm Green. And then I went in with buff and painted the skull. And while I had the buff out, I painted the skull on Stabby's chest. So now I'm going to highlight Slashy's shield. And since it's sort of perpendicular to the ground and isn't going to be getting a lot of direct light, I just decided to make it interesting by creating some opposed areas of highlight in the corners, using the same highlight colors as earlier. Now we'll clean up the outer edge of the shield by painting it with our unpronounceable gray, and then we'll highlight the skull with some ivory, and move back to our steel non-metallic metal effect, just for the edges of the shield. So that's an edge highlight, and I added a couple hot spots in 2 of the corners. Now using our steel colors, we will paint the edges of Screamy's banner. This isn't actually non-metallic metal, I just forgot to highlight it earlier, but it does use the same colors. So I'm highlighting this similarly to the way we did the fabric, focusing some highlights on some of the corners and the upturned edges, just to give it some interest. There's not a lot going on here. It's a pretty simple process. Once we've built it up with a few layers, I then did an edge highlight around all of the banner. Since we've got these colors out, I'm just stippling on some of the lighter gray over top of the neck piece. Now we'll return to our green non-metallic metal gradient, starting with Stabby. And what I decided to do here was, instead of painting all of the armor on one miniature at once, I'm switching between all the miniatures that have that same color. I'm not sure which way I liked better, doing it this way as a batch painting or doing an individual miniature all at once. I think there are advantages to both ways. This way might have been a little bit faster. Another difference here is, instead of sketching out my highlights ahead of time with a bright color, I just sort of started dark and built them up to the brightest highlight. There didn't seem to be as many tricky places here, so this way felt like it was a little more economical. Let me know down in the comments which way you prefer. Stabby has this heavily textured area on one of his shoulders. I'm essentially just sort of picking out the tops of each bend in the design and putting a highlight spot there. And we're on to the edge highlighting on Stabby here. Now we'll paint the red armor. So go back to the Hastur Purple to Ivory gradient, and we'll bring the highlights out the way we did with all the other armor. When doing the red, there were a few places where I felt like it was actually looking a little too pink. But once I finished it, I felt like the amount of pink wasn't overwhelming, and I did kind of like the look, so I decided not to do anything about it. I apologize for all the times I take the miniature off camera. I'm still trying to zero in on my camera setup and get everything in a position where I can capture everything and still have room to paint. So here we're just wrapping up the edge highlighting on Screamy. Now returning to our gray mix, we'll start on Screamy's sword, and we'll also do the gray on Stabby. I find swords to be much easier to do in non-metallic metal, at least to do a simple version of it. You essentially create two opposing light points on the blade, one on the upper part near the tip, and the other on the lower part near the base. Here you can see what I'm doing at normal speed. Screamy has these two steel circles in front of his armor that we need to get with this color. Screamy has a few notches in his sword that I'm highlighting with the lightest color. And now on to edge highlighting both these circles, and we'll also edge highlight the sword. And when you're doing the edge highlight on the sword, you want to also make sure you get the crease down the middle. I actually don't know what that's called. Here we're just wrapping up the non-metallic metal on Stabby. You can see where I got a little sloppy on that sword. I go back and fix that up with some of the darker gray later. And here we'll edge highlight Stabby's sword. Now we'll mix a gradient to do some non-metallic gold on the hilts of the two swords of Stabby and Screamy. For these, I just put opposing light points on either corner of the hilt, and then one at the bottom. Now we'll apply dark lining and paint the eyes of each miniature. We'll do this by thinning down a little bit of black ink with just some water. Be sure to touch your brush to a paper towel before applying any ink to the miniature. That way we can keep control of it and it doesn't leak into areas where we don't want it. We're going to apply this ink to every separation between different material and inside of any very small recesses. So for Stabby, who we're starting with here, this will include the separation on the front of his, loincloth, as well as the crevices on his knee pads and the recesses on his boots. Then we'll go through and separate the pieces of armor with a dark line and separate the pieces of armor from the fabric. And we'll apply this to each and every miniature in the same way. I'm trying to get some dark lining in all the crevices of this textured part of the armor and the shoulder. We'll also be using the ink to reinforce the darkness of the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. Continuing on with Screamy, we'll do this exactly the same way, putting the dark lining between all the different pieces of armor and separating the different parts of material on his outfit. I'm also using this to reinforce the line between the red and the gray parts of the banner. Let me know in the comments if you think I should try to actually paint on camera one of these times. Now I'm going through with some thinned down black ink, and I'm trying to fill in the little bits of texture that are on the banner. They appear to be scratches or dirty portions, so I'm just trying to emphasize those a bit. And then we'll move on and paint the eyes and mouth exactly as we did for Stabby. Now we're moving on to Slashy, and he's mostly armor. We'll separate the armor pieces the same way as we did the others. We'll also want to make sure we get some separation on the different portions of his shield. When you're dark lining these miniatures, you want to make sure you get in between the fingers so that you can pick those out a little bit more easily from a distance. For his little chainmail areas, I'm just using some thinned down black ink, almost applying it like a wash to get into the crevices of those textures and bring out the chainmail look of it. When the armor's done, we'll move on to painting the skull. So nice dark eyes, fill in the nose, fill in the teeth. I want to make sure we get nice dark lines in between each tooth so that they're really easy to pick out from a distance. Now rinse and repeat on Casty. He's mostly fabric, so we're just separating the different pieces of fabric. I'm also putting dark lines between all of the little textured elements of the brown on the front of his cloak. I'm emphasizing the middle of the chain links on his medallion, and we will also obviously paint the skull the same way we did before, making sure to pick out the teeth. On his little voodoo doll, we want to make sure we get the facial features so that they're easy to see. Here I'm thinning down the ink a little and applying it as a wash over the fur feather texture and also over the crow that's on his head. Once again, the same exact thing goes for Shooty. Once dark lining is complete on all the miniatures, we're going to add more detail to the eyes by giving them sort of a glowing effect. We're starting by applying a dot of pure white paint to the center of each eye. I'm only showing this on a couple of the miniatures, but it works the same way on all of them. Then for the green glow, I'm just getting fluorescent green paint and applying that right over top of the white once it's dry. Now we'll finish up these miniatures by painting the bases and applying a spray varnish. As in the previous episodes, I am painting the bases the same color as the game pieces. For the skeletons, I'm using Vallejo model color light green and then doing the edge in black. Upon final inspection, I decided to mix some gray and ivory together and just bring out the texture a little bit more on Screamy's furry neck piece. Once everything's completely dry, we'll apply some Tester's spray lacquer. Just like in all of the other episodes, you can go back to one of those to see exactly how that's done. All in all, the skeletons were pretty fun to paint. I hope you have as much fun painting them as I did. I hope this video was helpful. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button and subscribe to my channel. Click the bell icon so that you're notified when new videos are released. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And until next time, happy painting.